We are live, and I welcome those that are joining us on live streaming, and a special hello to the Lightfoots. Mike called me up earlier and said we'd be watching us live, so hello to Mike and Kathy, and as they're joining us online, and others as well. I know there are many others, and if you're watching us live, put in a little like. Put in a little like so I know that you've seen us tonight. And if you watch us later, at least put us a like so I know that you've been viewing our broadcast. Tonight is part three of the book of John. Now, John is so rich, I preach from it all the time. It's one of those books, I'd like to go through it verse by verse, but we're into John all the time. But I do want to point out a number of the bigger things in John, and hopefully give you a mindset of how to look at John when we read it in the purpose. As we read through it in the future and on various sermons that I'll preach from it. The thing I want to revisit and I need to emphasize is the purpose of John. The purpose of John. And we covered this in the last couple of weeks. The purpose of John we find in John 20. John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. And John writes, he says, therefore, many other signs. Let me pause there for a second. We're talking about signs tonight. The 7 signs or miracles of Jesus that John emphasizes. And I'll talk about those in a minute. But he says, therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these signs, these events, these things that John has recorded. He says, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name. And it's all about belief. And I talked a little bit about that word belief last week, where I said John really uses that word belief. He doesn't use the word trust, and he doesn't use the word faith or the Greek equivalent. But you see that word believe and to believe many, many times throughout the book. Signs are given so that you may believe. Jesus performed signs, or we'll oftentimes we'll call them miracles, if you will. Jesus performs these different miracles. And understand what a miracle is, first of all. A miracle is a suspension of the natural laws as we understand it, whether it be the laws of life or the laws of physics, the natural laws. I mean, think about it. Jesus walks on the water. That's not natural. That's suspension of some laws there that Jesus is able to do that. We see miracles happen, and nothing is impossible for Jesus. And so when we see these things He does so that people will believe that He is who He is. And so these are not mere demonstrations of power to impress people, but they are to provide deeper realities that could be perceived correctly with eyes of faith. Now, one thing that we find when Jesus performs their various signs and various miracles, it forces people to a decision point. You either believe what He says He is and what the signs point to, or you're against it, or you choose not to believe, or you choose to discredit it. And we're going to see the various priests and the Pharisees and the scribes, they get all upset. There's a miracle that happened, but He did it on the Sabbath. You broke a law. And they miss the forest for the trees, the kind of thing. They're off on a wrong tangent. Now, in John, there are a number of things that John has. It's interesting the way he has some things done in groups of 7. Last week we looked at the 7 I am statements of Jesus. You know, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the life and the resurrection. I am the good shepherd. And we read about all of these things, those 7 statements that he made. And I talked about, we're going to hit a little bit on it tonight about the I am statements. And do you remember from last week, the I am statements of Jesus come straight out of Exodus 3 verse 14, where God discloses himself to Moses. And Moses says, well, what is your name? And God says his name is I am who I am. And understand, that name is only a name that God can say. We can't say I am that I am, because we would say you are who you are. But only God can say I am that I am. And so, you know, we're dealing with verbs and grammar here a little bit, but it's such a holy name that he has. And the Hebrew, we take that you are who you are, and it works out to be a form that we would call Yahweh, okay? And how that works out in the Hebrew. Now, that's not an exact translation, but that's the word that it had boiled down to. But God said, I am that I am, and he says in a shortened version later, he says, you are to tell the children of Israel that I am sent me to you. So we see that in Jesus. But Jesus performs 7 signs during his public ministry. And if you remember from session 1, where we talked about John and we divided into certain sections, the first 18 verses is the prologue, you know, where we got John 1:1, you know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and we talk about that. Well, starting at chapter 1, verse 19, through chapter 12, verse 50, and that's the last verse in chapter 12, this is Jesus' public ministry. And then the next section from chapter 13 through the end of 17 is his private ministry. And it was dealt with primarily his disciples. Namely, 13, 14, 15, and 16 was the discourse that Jesus gives the night before he goes to the cross. And then in chapter 17 is his prayer, priestly prayer, the night before he goes to the cross. Then we have the Passion, which is the trial and crucifixion and resurrection that goes chapter 18 through the end of chapter 20, and then chapter 21 is a prologue. It's kind of an add-on at the end. But we're looking at from chapter 1, verse 19 through the end of chapter 12, Jesus' public ministry. And John records for us 7 signs, 7 miracles of Jesus. He didn't record them all. We know Jesus did a lot more, but he recorded a few of them. The first one that he did is in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And you know the story, and he was in Canaan, the wedding in Cana, and he turned the water into wine. Water into wine. And we're not going to go through and read it all, but I want to hit a couple of highlights here. It was the first manifestation of his glory, and we got to remember, who saw Jesus turn the water into wine? Who saw him? His mother saw it. Possibly his mother saw it. That she's the one that directed it. But the servants who filled the pots with water and his disciples, the general crowd didn't know about it. Okay? Now, I'm assuming you all have read the story before. You remember the great big stone pots that they filled, and these were pots that were generally filled with water for ceremonial purposes, for ceremonial washings and things. They filled it to the brim. They took a dipper of water out of one of them and took it to the head table, and the guy sipped it and said, you know, normally you serve the good stuff first. And when people have had their fill and they've gotten a little tipsy, then you bring out the rot gut, okay? You bring out the bad stuff. But he said, but you've saved the absolute best for last. Jesus just didn't turn it into wine. He turned it into the good stuff. Now, understand wine drinking back then. And to say, well, Jesus made grape juice and it was non-alcoholic, that's baloney. They had no way to make grape juice back then. They don't have the chemical processes that we have. When you make wine, it had alcohol in it. But the way they drank it was usually cut 5-to-1 or 7-to-1. And so it was flavored water. Strong drink in the Bible is drinking wine straight. But right now, the way they cut it down, it had less alcohol in it than 3-2 beer, if you will. But that's not the point. Jesus is able to overcome. I mean, there's a suspension of nature here. He turns water into wine, and it shows His glory. And in fact, look at chapter 2, verse 11. He says, this is the beginning of His signs. John doesn't call them miracles. He calls them signs. They're things that Jesus does to demonstrate to people who He is. This is the beginning of His signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested His glories. And here's the key, the very end of that verse. And His disciples believed in Him. We got to go back to chapter 20 and those last couple of verses where it says these things were written so that you may what? So that you may believe. Believe. We got to keep that in our minds when we look at these things. The second sign that Jesus did was over in chapter 4, verses 46 to 54, the healing of the nobleman's son or the royal official, depending upon your translation. Jesus is the giver of life. Now, what's interesting about this, and there's similar stories, they're not the same, but there's similar stories over in Matthew and Luke. But what happened here is Jesus performed this sign remotely. The official came up and said, please heal my son. And Jesus says, y'all aren't going to believe unless, signs and miracles are performed. Let me find that verse. And he says, verse 48, unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. And so he says, come down before my child dies. And he says, your child lives. And he went home. And on his way home, the servants met him. And what time did the child get better? And they told him about the 7th hour, and that was the same time that Jesus said. Isn't that interesting? He does it remotely. And here's the key verse in this. Look down to verses 53 and 54. So the Father knew it was at that hour in which Jesus said to him, your son lives. And he himself believed in his whole household. This is again a second sign that Jesus performed when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Jesus had done some other signs, but this is the second sign in Galilee at any rate. He no doubt performed more, but John is just emphasizing a few. The third sign that John emphasizes is the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 18. Now, this is one of the first ones that John records that he did it on the Sabbath. But yet here's this lame man. And there's a few things that Jesus says that gets people upset with him. Look at John 5, verses 16 to 18. He says, for this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Remember what Jesus said, I think it was over in Matthew, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, talked about, these signs do not necessarily cause people to believe. They're validating what Jesus is to those who will believe. And he says in here, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath, verse 17, but he answered them, My Father is working until now, and I myself am working. Verse 18, for this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Boy, we're only up to chapter 5, and they're already seeking to kill him. Because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. And here again, another emphasis in John. He says that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and the deity of Jesus is emphasized. Is emphasized throughout all of this. This leads to, we're going to talk next week about the different discourses of Jesus, but this leads into his third discourses later on in 5 about his relationship with the Father. The fourth sign that Jesus performs, and this is recorded in all 4 Gospels, is the feeding of the 5,000 in Galilee. Feeding of the 5,000. Jesus is the supplier of every human need. Now, if you look into the latter part of chapter 6, this leads into the discourse where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. And but he delivers all of this. He makes the bread, from the loaves and the fishes. And look down at verse 14, John 6, verse 14. Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, truly, this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, does that mean that they believe? No, they thought this was the prophet, and this was a pretty neat thing. But it's interesting. But they haven't really believed yet. They haven't really believed yet. And in fact, another sign that's going to come up here, we're going to talk about here in a minute, is the walking on the water. They were on one side of the Sea of Galilee, and then the boats were launched to go to the other side. They didn't see Jesus getting into any of the boats, and we know that he walks across the Sea of Galilee, and we'll talk about that here in a second. He shows up over on the other side. And they said, well, how did you get here? And Jesus goes on to say, in verse 26, chapter 6, verse 26 says, Jesus answered them and said, truly, truly, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. They were looking for a free lunch. They weren't, what can I get from this guy? He gave us all this free stuff. Food was a hot commodity back in that day. And he goes on to say in verse 27, do not work for food which perishes, but for food which endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him the Father, God, has set his seal. And so, and we go into that discourse we're going to talk about next week. But we have the next sign is his walking on water, verses chapter 6, 16 through 21. Jesus is above all the natural and physical laws. And here Jesus illustrates who he is. He illustrates that he is the great I am. And look at chapter 6, verses 19 to 20. It says, then when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, now if you look at the Sea of Galilee is about 7 miles across. It's a lake at best. It's not a sea. But when they've gone 3 or 4 miles, and what does that mean? They were right smack dab in the middle of the lake, okay? And the storm pops up and the waves were there. They were struggling and so on and so forth. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat. They were frightened. Verse 20, but he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Now what's recorded in the Greek here? What is recorded in the Greek, and if you remember our lesson from last week, what Jesus says is ego eimi. He didn't say it is I, because that's what makes sense to us in English. But what he said was, I am, do not fear. Do not be afraid. He says, I am. Now, how did the disciples take that? They probably took it as, it is I, okay? It's me, guys, you know. That's probably how they took it. But, you know, it's interesting the way John writes. He puts these subtle little things throughout. And the person who has read through this and read through it a second time and read through John maybe a third time, they pick up on the ego of me. They pick up on I am. No one else says I am, but Jesus. But Jesus. They pick up on the I am here. And so a reader of the gospel would recognize the wording, at least in the Greek here. But we change it a little bit. It's not so much as that we change it, we write down what makes sense in our language. But looking at the Greek, it's ego of me. It is I. Verse 21, John 6, verse 21. So they were willing to receive him into the boat. Now get this. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. In other words, they went the other 3 or 4 miles to the other side. I mean, Jesus gets into the boat, bam, they are there. That's another miracle, but we don't mention it as that. But immediately they were there. It's just kind of like, wow. You know, when we look at Jesus, it's you know, one of my favorite stories about Jesus is over in Mark, I think it's chapter 4, you know, where he's asleep on the boat and there's the big storm and he gets up, peace be still, and all of a sudden, and in the midst of the huge storm, all of a sudden everything is quiet. And the disciples, they were scared before, now they are terrified. Who is this guy, really? And so it's a sign. This is who I am. It's a demonstration of power here. And it's just a small piece of it. You got to remember, especially as we were looking at Colossians last Sunday, but you look at Colossians chapter 1, and it talks about who Jesus is in relationship to creation. Jesus is the very agent of creation. And it says over in Colossians 1, I think it's verses 17 or 18, it says, in him all things consist. It's Jesus is responsible for it all. For him to walk on the water, for him to calm the seas, it's nothing. It's nothing. We say, wow, but in the big scheme of things, it's nothing really compared to what he has done. The 6th sign, this is one of my favorite stories, is all of chapter 9. All of chapter 9, where Jesus heals the blind man. Now, was it a year or 2 ago, I did a 2-sermon series on this one. In fact, to preach through this took 2 Sundays to go through. But this is the sign about Jesus. You remember what Jesus gave over in chapter 8. In chapter 8, verse 12 or 14, I forget, Jesus says, I am light of the world. And then over in chapter 9, he opens the eyes of the man born blind. We look at verse 2, chapter 9, verse 2. Who sinned? You know, did he sin? Did his parents sin? Jesus says, no one sinned. It was this way so that the works of God may be displayed. Or in the Greek, it's more so that the works of God can be revealed, so you can see his glory. And so we see this blind man, we go through this whole story, we see this blind man, he gains sight not only physically, but spiritually. His spiritual sight starts opening, and getting bigger and bigger. You know, it was a man named Jesus opened my eyes, because they're questioning him. And then later on, well, he must be a prophet. You know, he couldn't be a sinner because, you know, and he's teaching the Pharisees, and the Pharisees end up excommunicating him, throwing him out of the synagogue. And yet we look at the Pharisees, and they, you know, is this really the guy? And his parents says, yeah, he's our son. And they don't want to get any of it on them, you know, so they say, you ask him, he's of age. And the guy says, you know, no, you've never heard of anybody born blind receiving their sight. Who is this guy? And this is a great chapter to read. And we all of a sudden, and actually, Jesus does this remotely. Remember, he spits, make a little mud, he puts it on his eyes, he sends him to the pool, and he says, wash. That's the last time we see Jesus till the very end of the story. The man is in center stage, but Jesus is the subject of all of this. Who made you see? Who is this Jesus? Then we get to the very end, verses 35 to 41. Jesus heard that they had put him out. They excommunicated him out of the synagogue because, this guy, the light bulb came on. He gets the clue. He believes in Jesus, okay? And the Pharisees can't stand it. And they heard that he had put him out, and finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Verse 36, he answered, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and he is the one talking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Verse 39, Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, we're not blind too, are we? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say we see, your sin remains. It's interesting. Jesus brings sight to this man born blind. And this guy gets a lot more than his physical eyesight. He gets his spiritual sight. At the same time, the Pharisees go blind. They go blind spiritually. And so with these signs of Jesus, it's, believe it or not, acceptance or rejection. And you've got to remember here, part of the problem was that Jesus put mud on his eyes on the Sabbath. Boy, that was the unpardonable sin according to them. But you see, acceptance brings grace. Rejection brings judgment. The seventh sign, the last sign in Jesus' public ministry is the raising of Lazarus. Raising of Lazarus in Bethany, chapter 11. We look at those in the first 45 verses. And this is where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Let's back up just a little bit. Look at the very last couple of verses in chapter 10. And it says, therefore they were seeking to seize him, and he eluded their grasp. They were wanting to put Jesus to death, but it wasn't time yet. Okay, Jesus had a few more things to do. And he says that he went away beyond the Jordan to the place where John was first baptizing, and he was staying there. Many came to him and were saying, while John performed no sign, talking about John the Baptist, all John the Baptist did was preach and baptize. He said, perform no sign, yet everything John said about this man was true. Verse 42, many believed. There's that word again. Many believed in him there. Then we get into chapter 11, and word comes to Jesus that Lazarus is sick. Verse 3, 11 verse 3. So the sisters sent word to him, that's Mary and Martha, saying, Lord, behold, the one you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified in it. I was looking at my commentaries, and we go into the Greek there. The Greek is a little subtle here. It's not so much as that God will receive glory because Lazarus is raised, as much as it is that the glory of God might be revealed. Might be revealed. God has the glory. And now our eyes need to be open to that glory. And he says, now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed another 2 days longer in the place where he was. What's wrong with that? He's sick. Shouldn't he rush up and heal him? Well, he knew he was sick. He knew he was going to die. And so he waited until Lazarus was dead. And make no mistake here, Lazarus was dead. When Jesus came and raised him from the dead, it was not he wasn't Resuscitated, thank you. He wasn't resuscitated. He was raised from the dead. How do we know that he was dead? I like it over in verse 42. Excuse me, not verse 42. Verse 39. Jesus says, remove the stone. And Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days. I like the King James here. It says, for he stinketh. Okay? Lazarus wasn't just dead. He was rotten. Okay? He was rotten away. Jesus, over in verse 14 to 15, Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sake that I was not there, so that you may believe. So that you may believe, but let us go to him. Then we come over and we get that shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. That's the shortest verse in the English Bible. In the Greek, it's 3 words. The Jesus wept. They always put the article even before a proper name. The shortest verse in the Bible, just a piece of trivia, in the Greek Bible is over in 1 Thessalonians 5:16, where we have rejoice only. Well, it's only just 2 words in the Greek there. 3 words in there. Trivia. But at any rate, Jesus, when they rolled the stone away, verse 41 says they removed the stone. Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because the people standing around, I said it so that they may believe that you sent me. Again, these signs of Jesus were very deceptive or decisive. Decisive. They're very decisive. Many believed and others still rejected. Look down at verse 45 to 48. It says, Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw that he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them of the things which Jesus had done. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. They were worried about me. Okay? Their concern overrode with the signs. They couldn't dispute the signs. They couldn't dispute that Lazarus was alive. So what did they do? They planned to kill Jesus. But over in chapter 12, it's interesting. It says verses 9 to 11, the large crowd of the Jews then learned that he was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also. We're going to get rid of the evidence. Because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. These are 7 public signs that Jesus did. Now we have the miracle of his resurrection from the dead and so on and so forth. There's one other miracle recorded in the epilogue over in chapter 21. And that was where, they were waiting on Jesus and they're standing around the Sea of Galilee and Peter said, I want to go fishing. So they went fishing and they didn't catch anything. Jesus shows up on shore, but they don't recognize him. And he says, well, put your nets on the other side. And they caught, how many fish? Anybody remember?
53.
But the nets did not break. They were to that point, but they caught 153 fish.
It's our house number.
Huh?
It's our house.
It's your house number, okay. What's the significance of 153? I don't know. There have been, as one commentator says, there's way too much ink wasted on that. What it meant was somebody took account. There was an eyewitness who wrote this, okay? And there was a lot of fish, but the nets didn't break, which was a miracle in and of itself. Huh? One of the disciples, and John recorded it. And so we've got a miracle there. But we look at these miracles, the things that we've got to understand. Why did John choose these miracles? So that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And by believing, you may have life in him. It's for belief. Now we're going to get into his next week. We're going to get into his public discourses, his public sermons, his public talking, things that he did publicly. We're not going to get so much into like chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. Those were all private, last-minute instructions to his disciples. And boy, there's a dozen messages right there. But we're going to look at his discourses next week. And this way, we're going to cover the book here. Questions? I think I've gone over a few minutes, but anyway. Yes, sir.
It would be nice to know what the disciples amongst themselves discussed when they was in the middle of the lake and all of a sudden they found themselves on the shore.
It doesn't say. It leaves that for speculation. You know, John didn't record everything, you know, but boy, it was just kind of like, here again, John is one of those books you've got to read over and over and over again to catch all the nuance. You've seen old movies, and you've got to watch the movie over and over again to catch the little tidbits that are in there. John is like that. You've got to read it over and over to catch all that's in there. And even then, you're not going to catch them all.
Well, you know, there's a lot of miracles performed today.
Yes, there are. I believe miracles happen today.
Yeah. If man can't explain it, then
That's right. If we can't explain it, and it doesn't matter, even if we could explain it, that doesn't mean that God didn't bring about the circumstances for things to happen. All right, I'm seeing all the kids back there, so they're waiting for us to be dismissed. So let me go ahead and pray, and we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, we just thank you again for your word. And Lord, your word is such that we have to read it over and over again to get more and more and more complete meaning from it. We thank you for your word. We thank you for speaking to us through your word. And now, Lord, may we take your word and hide it in our heart. Lord, take it out in the world. There's a world around us that needs to hear your word and needs to hear the gospel, whom you have entrusted with us. Lord, go with us, protect us, guide us, direct us, and may Jesus be glorified in all that we say and do. For it's in his holy name we pray. Amen. God bless you all. Y'all have a great, great rest of the week.